Neurotic Literature by James Lark. This story: The 10 Shameful Memories That Kill You. It was never about saving society. I thought the article was interesting, a little bit important even. Of scientific value rather than practical use. A curiosity. I imagined perhaps that I had finally found, a thing that was mine. A legacy. I never saw it leading to this. Not that I am going to save society. Never was. This is just a pathetic last-ditch gasp before I'm forced to give it up. One way or the other. If you are unlikely enough to hear this, and I admit it is highly unlikely, my brief and increasingly irregular scurries from the house to sneak a memory stick into the pocket of a passerby or a CD onto a bookstand are surely observed, every recording undoubtedly retrieved moments later. You're probably one of them, having a laugh at my pitiful endeavours before destroying my words again. But if you did pick this up by accident, find it lodged in your romantic novel or nestling in the pocket of your jacket, well, you probably ought to destroy it yourself. It can bring you no happiness. You can do nothing with the information. Believe me, I've tried. I only continue these attempts to disseminate what I know, what I suspect, as a feeble, final act of defiance. Oh, Becky, I wish you were here. Maybe together we could have taken them on. Where are they? Who are they? In my paranoia, I have started to see them everywhere. It was Becky who encouraged me to write the article in the first place. Becky is an actress. Well, a resting actress. She had been working Saturday afternoons at the pub, which is when I tended to be in the library, but there was an overlap, and somehow we clicked. I can't remember when exactly. No, I can. It was when she asked where I had been, and I said, at the British Library. Doing what? She asked. Reading about Edward J. Peng, I explained, somewhat exaggerating the success of my research. She seemed interested, so when she asked who he was, I gave her a brief précis, and it kind of took off from there. I haven't often talked about Peng's theories. I'm not sure why. It perhaps feels rather personal, puts me in a vulnerable place. But having such a willing pair of ears was refreshing, and actually it gave me a chance to air a few of the ideas properly and sort out my own thinking on the matter. We batted them about for a bit. Becky asked some perceptive questions, and she offered to help track down details about Edward J. Peng, though with as little success as I'd had. We even went out for dinner a couple of times, not on a date, just to chat about ideas. Anyway, it was Becky who suggested I write it down. If the problem with Peng's book is that it's so boring, she said, why not write it down in a way that's more approachable? After all, the way you've described it to me is entertaining enough. I'm not really a writer, I admitted, but she was having none of it. You've a gift, she said. You're a born communicator. Putting it in writing is just a muscle you haven't exercised for a while. So I started to exercise it. Gerontology and the Overdeveloped Superego by Edward J. Peng, Cambridge University Press, 1996, is an unassuming volume to look at and an exceedingly dull read. Perhaps if it had a flashier title or a more interesting cover, or even a few jokes to help the text skip along, it would be more widely known. As it is, I can find no contemporaneous reviews from the year of its publication, or articles referring to it. A pretty thorough search of the internet has not turned up a single reference to the book beyond its title, and the fact that you can buy second-hand copies from the kind of places that deal in that sort of thing. It only ever had the one print run, so you might assume that it would be quite a rarity, but since nobody actually seems to want it, you won't have to part with a great deal of money to get hold of a copy for yourself. I suppose Edward J. Peng might have delivered some lectures on the book's themes, either while he was researching it or to promote its publication, but again I can find no evidence for this, or indeed any information about Edward J. Peng himself. The brief biography in the flyleaf describes him as a senior research fellow at Bangor University. But if this was true in 1996, Bangor University have since erased any record of his having been there and are unable to furnish me with any information as to what happened to him next, or even whether he is still alive. I have done a fair bit of digging, and it would appear that whoever he was, Edward J. Peng, left absolutely no impression on anyone, either in an academic or a social context. To be honest, his prose style gives a pretty clear indication of why this might have been the case. The only reason I have a copy of his book myself is that when I was an undergraduate at York, studying art history, by the way, a subject in no way related to Peng's field, there was a book clearance outlet near Market Square which had 2 rooms dedicated to heavily discounted academic works, and, being a rather pretentious young man, I would regularly buy the very cheapest of these to put on my shelves in the hope that I would appear intellectual. Given the unappealing look and content of these books, I mean, they were in a clearance shop for a reason, I now realise that they probably made me look an extremely dull person. But I shouldn't be too hard on myself. One of the reasons to go to university is to develop self-awareness, after all. Gerontology and the overdeveloped superego was one of these unnecessary purchases, and it was a thick enough tome to display those impressive-sounding words nice and clearly to all potential admirers of my scholarly prowess. Though, come to think of it, none of my university friends once mentioned the contents of my bookshelf, so I now dare to hope that my efforts went completely unnoticed. Needless to say, I had no interest at all in gerontology or the overdeveloped superego, and the point of the books on my shelf was emphatically not that I would ever read them. However, a bout of glandular fever in my 3rd year resulted in several months of my being restricted, on and off, to my room at university, and a combination of sheer boredom and the feeling that I might at least take advantage of my incarceration to expand my mind led me, eventually, to examine my affected literary purchases. You must remember that this was before every student had a computer and a television in their room, or could stream hours of entertainment on a mobile phone. The most sophisticated entertainment I had to hand was a cassette player, and after weeks of isolation, even the BBC radio collection Goon Show tapes had lost their lustre. Which is how I ended up reading the work of Edward J. Peng, an activity I am conceivably the only person to have undertaken. This is a pity, because the book has startling implications for the way in which we ought to understand life and death itself. It says a great deal about the impact of Peng's theories, which, by the way, I am convinced are entirely correct, that in spite of the deeply boring manner in which they are presented, I read Gerontology and the Overdeveloped Superego from cover to cover in under a week. Then I read it again. Peng begins by suggesting that the human body is designed to endure well beyond the 80 or so years that we tend to consider a fairly good innings. There is a slightly fatuous reference to Abraham and the pre-flood human lifespan, but on the whole, the chapter is compellingly argued and rigorously backed up by established scientific theses, particularly the work of noted anthropologist Alexander Taylor, whose research in the late 19th and early 20th centuries formed the basis of a great deal of our modern understanding of human biology. I should say that Peng doesn't for a moment hold up Noah's 900 years as a realistic bar, but he does state that as a species, we could comfortably hope for an average age of closer to 150 years. This point is made both with scientific precision and, unusually for this book, briefly. But then it is really only restating what has been comprehensively argued by others, and only acts as a preamble to Peng's main thesis. Where Peng departs from established scientific philosophy is in the factors which he claims cause premature aging and death. It is generally understood that these are physical and environmental, that one's lifespan is determined by one's genes and one's circumstances. A human possessing healthy DNA, who grows up with 3 meals a day, warm clothes, and good hygiene, is probably going to live for longer than a person raised in a workhouse and subjected to nutritional deprivation, extremes of climate, and disease, not to mention human factors like alcohol and drug abuse, or, to push the argument to its limit, a bullet to the head. Peng acknowledges that these are all factors in determining lifespan, He doesn't go so far as to point out that a bullet to the head is somewhat immutable as a barrier to long life, but he's not in denial where external influences are concerned. These, however, pale in significance, he argues, next to the primary cause of precipitate infirmity and our violently condensed existence. The main cause of early death in human beings, Peng states, is shame. Shame. Peng writes about it as if it is a disease. Indeed, after reading his book, one is left with the impression that shame is as much a disorder of human function as, say, typhoid. It is shame, he says, that causes the most biological damage to our bodies and ultimately results in systems failing. Shame, he goes on to argue at length, is directly related to cell death. Shame compromises immunity, and it is because of cumulative shame that our bodies eventually give up altogether. The immediate and obvious conclusion, although Peng wouldn't dream of stating anything so prurient, is that this explains exactly why people apparently incapable of feeling shame seem to live so much longer than the rest of us. Insert your own choice of shameless politician, celebrity or self-styled influencer. There are plenty to choose from. The ones who seem to lead the most unhealthy lifestyles, who indulge in all of the vices and in some cases appear to have been inflated into their ill-fitting suits, but nevertheless endure for year after year, whilst all around them beloved and talented people from every other walk of life pop their clogs, however sensibly they seem to have been looking after themselves. Only the good die young, as both Billy Joel and Brian May set to music, and whilst as statements go it is a bit general and not terribly scientific, it does express a widespread sentiment. The more I study Peng's book, the more it appears to offer an explanation. Not that Peng ever expresses his ideas in such a sensationalist way. No, Edward J. Peng is scrupulously dispassionate, and whilst his theories are nothing less than utterly mind-blowing, he exercises every atom of self-control to ensure that it is communicated in the most plodding, pedestrian way possible. He explains that the initial thesis was extrapolated from the ancient Chinese proverb, 10 shameful memories kill as surely as a knife to the heart, which he argues was intended by the ancient thinkers not so much as philosophy as medical advice. His lengthy justification for this assertion is one of the book's most tedious excursions. And although he proceeds to elaborate on the real meaning of 10 shameful memories, stating the obvious objection that we tend to endure many more than a mere 10 moments of shame before dropping dead, he clings to the idea that when it comes to momentous points of disgrace, 10 actually is pretty much the human limit. The problem with shame, he explains, is that it is not a momentary experience, but a lasting affliction. The event that causes the shame may be fleeting, but the memory haunts us forever, and so the damage inflicted is continuous. Once we experience shame, he says, it lives with us, eating away at ourselves and aging us from that point on. Which is why a truly lingering shameful memory, the kind that you try to put behind you but which nevertheless pops up to taunt you when you're least expecting it, which has you waking up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat or whimpering out loud, is so lethal. Less significant moments of shame, he goes on to say, will still do their damage, but obviously in proportion to the shame felt and the extent to which it lingers. These tiny shameful memories will undoubtedly reduce a lifespan. Ironically, reliving the memory of the posturing that put Peng's book on my shelf is itself something that has caused enough shame to take, if not years, then certainly precious days off my life. But without being all that specific, he seems to imply that it would take a substantial number of such trivial memories to add up to the equivalent of one of the 10 that actually kill you. This is one of the points on which I feel Peng's book badly needs further elucidation. So intent on being ruthlessly scientific, he doesn't give a single example of the kind of shame which would be considered so significant as to move you 1/10 of the way towards your expiry date. But then, as he is at pains to point out elsewhere, shame is essentially a self-inflicted response, albeit one influenced predominantly by the society in which one lives, so it is impossible to apply any constant measure. In fact, levels of shame are almost entirely illogical. Again, this is a topic on which Peng remains stubbornly silent. It is common, for example, for people to experience a far more painfully prolonged sense of shame over being discovered indulging in an innocent session of onanism than by, say, a marital infidelity. Once again, I would bring to your attention the idea that we are at the mercy of our own particular code of standards, or those with which we were brought up. They are not always one and the same, but they often are, and that the only logical conclusion is that those not afflicted by shame can expect to live a great deal longer. I suppose that under those circumstances it would be pointless to try and establish any specific scale for shame. Even so, I wish that Peng had tried. The other thing that Peng resolutely refuses to investigate is whether there is any solution to the problem. A cure, if you will. Is there any way to counter the damaging effects of shame once it has set to work on your mortality? Peng has nothing to say on the matter, and after years of investigation of my own, I continue to draw a blank. Because, as you may have inferred, having immersed myself in Peng's work, it became something of an obsession. I searched for other writing on the subject. There isn't any. I scribbled my own notes and essays, many of them so naive and poorly reasoned that their existence continues to shorten my life. And I have repeatedly tried to track down Edward J. Peng, or anyone who knew him, without success. Hence my approaches to Bangor University and late-night trawls through the internet for details. I feel that there must be more, that he must have known more, that the man who came up with the theory has more incisive conclusions to offer than those provided by a book that instead spends much of its monotonous middle section comparing historical human lifespan to the religious and societal codes of the times, and, just when it seems to be leading towards a spicier conclusion, arrives at a leaden chapter describing in detail the society of the Moni tribe of Dutch New Guinea, that is, West Papua, and explaining their low mortality in relation to the absence of Western concepts of shame. It is clear that Peng travelled to Indonesia specifically to research this, and was indeed one of the first white men to live among the Moni people. How he manages to make what must have been a groundbreaking anthropological adventure sound about as exciting as a trip to Sainsbury's is one of his particular talents. But I digress. I found writing pretty time-consuming, and I would certainly have given up on it but for Becky's encouragement. "Come on," she'd say, as I came into the pub to work after a fruitless day staring at a blank piece of paper. "It's a theory people need to hear. Once you've written it down, you can flog it to the scientific journals or the Daily Mail or whatever." So, after several false starts and many months of an effort that felt a lot like pulling teeth, I finished a draft with which I was happy enough to show Becky. Though I'll be honest, I spent several weeks pretending I was still working on it. I had so little confidence in what I'd done. She gave it back to me with notes, and I took them on board, reluctantly in some places. "Make it more relatable," she urged. "Tell us about its importance to you." But those efforts paled next to the depressing process of sending the finished article around. I sent it to scientific journals, I sent it to the Daily Mail, I sent it to niche magazines, to bloggers, to individual journalists, to local radio stations. I was expecting rejection, but what I got was even worse. Nothing. Nothing at all. Not a single reply. Nobody was interested. Nobody was even polite enough to say they weren't interested. Not that I was surprised. "It's not good enough," I said to Becky. "Bollocks," she said. "Well, clearly it's not," I argued. Then I said, "At least I can say I tried." "No, you bloody cannot," she retorted. "That's not trying. Sending it out to a few people and then giving up. What you need to do is go back to the article, do another rewrite, and get it back out there. It's like acting. I'm in and out of auditions all the time. Audition after audition, rejection after rejection, but you don't see me giving up, do you?" "I don't see you acting either," I snapped back, which I very much regret saying now. Talk about shameful memories. That one's going to cost me a good few years, I can tell you. But she was right. So the next day I printed out my article, took it to the library, and prepared to give it as thorough a going over as I could. Edward J. Peng not only changed the way I understood my life, he changed its whole direction. Although there were other factors in my dropping out of university and leaving the history of art in the past, it proved symptomatic of the pattern my life has followed since. Working in a characterless Irish theme pub was not a vocational path, but it leaves much of the day free for research, and location-wise it combines well with the British Library. I wish that my fervour ever had altruistic or even academic motives. The truth, and perhaps the reason why I was so completely drawn to such an unremittingly boring book in the first place, is that I am personally afflicted with vast quantities of shame. I don't mean that I have led a particularly shameful life. I am, to all intents, a law-abiding citizen, and my indiscretions have been few. I'm almost ashamed of how bland and unadventurous a path I have trodden. But for whatever reason, and I'm going to be a cliché and blame my parents, I've always suffered from an anxiety-inducing abundance of shame over what I suspect many would consider fairly insignificant occurrences. I have already spoken of my internalised shame over the pretensions of my student days, and hinted at my deep sense of inadequacy over my attempts at academic writing. But those are just skimming the surface of a life so full of shame that sometimes I literally can't sleep at night. For example, there is a memory from primary school, I suppose I would have been 7 or 8, of getting changed for a PE lesson on a day when my teacher, Ms. Miskill, an unsympathetic Irish lady who I think was all the same not so deadly as her name suggests, was having one of her regular rants about lost property and unnamed kit. Now, my mother, for all that she landed me with an overactive sense of shame, did provide an unfailing reliability when it came to naming clothes, a material name tag sewn into every item of mine with stitching so fast that the clothes would fall apart before the name tag came off, so I made the mistake of assuming that Ms. Miskill's rant did not apply to me. I was shirtless and halfway into my PE shorts when she noticed that I had apparently ignored her instructions, and with a shout that silenced the entire class, she issued a command to bring my PE shorts to her for inspection before I even thought about putting them on. So, under her steely gaze, and viewed by my now completely attentive classmates, I walked to the front of the room. Fortune had, typically, landed me with a desk about as far from the front as it could get, so the excruciating journey required me to walk past every other pupil wearing only pants and socks. One by one, they let out wolf whistles and oohs and spiteful giggles. Ms. Miskill clearly thought that this was well deserved, as she did nothing to suppress the ridicule. Having checked my shorts and found them to be sufficiently named, she instructed me to go back to my desk, and the whole thing happened again, the Mexican wave of mockery, even more noisy and gleeful. Perhaps that's where it started. The intensity of my shame, I mean. Being forced to parade in front of one's peers wearing nothing but underwear is a textbook nightmare at any age, isn't it? So to undergo the experience at a formative time must have mental consequences. You'll note that there is a strong element of injustice in the story as well, since my shorts were decisively named and my disobedience unintentional. That is something of a theme in my most shameful moments, as if I have been unfairly burdened with a load of shame that I don't actually deserve, and when, arguably, someone else might have more legitimately taken the hit to their mortality. I mean, I doubt Ms. Miskill lost any sleep over my ordeal. A strong contender for most unjust apportioning of shame, and one that will certainly cost me some of my lifespan to recount, is the week of work experience I did when I was studying for my A-levels, which, either because the options were poor or because I lacked the imagination to look for better ones, I did at a local insurance firm with a fellow pupil called Nick Baker, and which ended a day early with me getting a thorough dressing down by the head of IT for looking at pornography on my work computer. The fact that I had done no such thing in no way mitigates the utterly gut-wrenching sense of shame associated with the memory. This was the earliest days of the internet. I'm not even sure I was aware that the computer I was working on had the capability. These were the days when networks tended to be internal rather than external. I simply had the misfortune to be doing work experience with somebody who had technical know-how, the chutzpah to look at porn on a work computer, and who was savvy enough to do it using somebody else's account details. I wonder if Nick Baker knew that he was taking years off my life with the same clinical surety as a knife through the ribs. Actually, from what I remember of Nick Baker, I don't imagine that he would have been at all bothered. Wherever he has ended up, I predict that he will lead a long life, free of shame. The pants incident, by the way, is inextricably linked in my mind to another poisonous reminiscence devouring my years, that of my attempted wooing of Amanda Brown, purely because she was in my class at primary school, and was therefore one of the faces wolf-whistling and giggling as I did my trouserless walk of shame. My infatuation with her can't have started until a good couple of years after that, but memory being what it is and doing what it does, it has made Amanda one of the stars of the incident, her sweet face scornfully laughing with great pleasure at my discomfort. I may be doing her a disservice. She was a nice girl as far as I can remember, and maybe she didn't go along with the laughing and jeering at all. Well, she probably did, but that's peer pressure, isn't it? Let's imagine that she participated unwillingly. As for the time when she actually did laugh mockingly in my face, I can hardly hold that against her. She was an 11-year-old wholly unprepared for the horror of a boy in her class sincerely professing his love for her in the form of a poem. How was she supposed to react? By the way, the fact that my memory has to some extent conflated the two events doesn't mean that they count as a single point of shame. Amanda's utter contempt, her laughter in the face of my faltering rhyming couplets, is a definite standalone toxin. Whether it's more because of the poem or the response, I couldn't say. The conflation with the pants incident has, if anything, made both memories even more deadly. By extension, I suppose Amanda's rejection also resulted in a further persistent area of shame, which is my lack of a partner. Something that oughtn't be anything to feel ashamed of, but which, nevertheless, my parents have turned into a huge source of guilt, thanks to their unintentionally reproachful inquiries as to the situation whenever I see them. Perhaps it wouldn't matter so much if I wasn't an only child, the only one able to carry on the family line. I feel culpable for not trying harder, for not using a dating app, or going out to try and find a significant other in a club or a bar or a church or something. But I've never had much success with the fair sex, and certainly after Amanda I never attempted to read poetry to a girl, or indeed to speak sincerely to one. For a while my parents would gently ask leading questions to try to discover whether I was gay, which made me feel shame that I might be coming across as homosexual, as well as shame for the latent homophobia that the first shame demonstrated. If these all seem like weighty, Freudian examples of the shame I carry, don't imagine that there aren't the most trivial memories mixed in with them. The time my bicycle chain broke after I had suffered a litany of bike problems, and I angrily threw the bloody thing into the road without stopping to think that there might be other vehicles using it. I still flush when I remember the sight of my bike sailing out into the road, improbably staying upright on two wheels, as the approaching car slammed on its brakes and skidded 90 degrees to avoid the unexpected obstacle. The icing on that shameful cake is that the driver was so confused by the riderless visage that she assumed it was her fault and gave me a lift the rest of the way. I sat in the comfort of her vehicle, watching her shaking and apologising, allowing her to think that she had somehow knocked my bike from under me and taking full advantage of her guilt to reach my destination in comfort. I do hope that the detour she took went some way to assuaging the long-term effects of any shame she felt. Certainly, in that instance, it feels fair that I experience an onslaught of lethal remorse whenever I think back to it. Or there was the wedding a few years ago. Spare me the memory of that wedding, at which I was placed on a table of perfectly pleasant and extremely well-spoken strangers who, at one point during the meal, began to talk politics. They were talking about politics at a wedding, of all places. Where is their shame? And when the conversation turned to anti-Semitism, I was so annoyed at their reductive and partisan approach to an important subject that I tried to contribute and... Oh, this is too recent, too raw a memory. I can feel this shame eating away at my remaining years with an intensity that comes with proximity. Or is it just the awfulness of the way I was perceived by every guest at that table? Whichever it is, all I would say is that my intentions were good, but I've never been the most articulate person, not when speaking, and wine had been consumed. Anyway, it was immediately clear that whatever I had said, well, wasn't clear, I mean. And in a follow-up attempt to suggest that the tabloid press conflating genuine anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of the Israeli government was unhelpful to say the least, I heard my pathetic, stuttering voice whining that we need to work out what anti-Semitism really is, and realised that everyone at the table was staring at me in the horrified conviction that they were sitting with a hardened anti-Semite. A clumsy argument clumsily made, sure, but is it really fair that I'm closer to death as a result of having made it? and indeed closer than those smug onlookers, patronising me with their disapproval when they had been making equally banal and insulting points of their own, only without the self-awareness to realise it. And they were the ones who started the whole ill-judged conversation to begin with, damn their eyes. I'm still not sure to what extent that shame is mine to own, but my God, I've owned all of it, the whole lot, entirely and repeatedly, the stares of those strangers etched into my memory. I laid claim to that shame from the word go. I spent the speeches wishing that a hole would appear beneath my chair and swallow me up, and hid in the toilets for the rest of the nuptial celebrations in order to wave off the bride and groom before beating a hasty retreat to a bed and breakfast where I didn't manage to sleep at all. I don't go to weddings anymore. Life is too precious. Those are just the memories that haunt every waking and sleeping hour of my life, the ones which eat away at my cells and gnaw at my mortality each minute. 6 of them. 6 major moments of shame. Added to the smaller memories, so many I couldn't begin to count them, how many of the theoretical 10 does that leave? I find that I have almost exhausted my capacity for shame at a mere 41 years of age. At this rate, I must have 10 years left, 15 at most. In my desperation to find answers, and my frustration over the lack of any resources beyond the book itself, I occasionally found myself wondering whether there's more than meets the eye to the mystery of Edward J. Peng and the lack of any information pertaining to him and his work. How could an academic so thoroughly disappear in every sense, the only trace of his ever having existed relegated to a clearance bookshop? Could it be that his discovery was noticed after all, but was considered too incendiary, too important, to be further disseminated amongst society? I have mused upon the many reasons why a person, or people, would wish to prevent anyone from finding out what it is that's killing us so unnecessarily early. I have briefly imagined them jealously guarding the secret. Well, we all love a conspiracy theory, don't we? The truth is more mundane. Nobody has heard of Edward J. Peng because, as gerontology and the overdeveloped superego attests, he was utterly, unforgivably boring. He had a brilliant theory which, presumably in person as much as in his writing, he had no ability to communicate. It's no wonder that his theories are not more widely known. The only surprising detail, in fact, is that anybody thought it was worth publishing at all. It was only when I went back to my article, when I took it to the library for a thorough going over, that I saw what had been staring me in the face for so many years. How I could have missed such a blindingly obvious fact, I don't know, but in an instant I saw it. The book had been published in 1996, but Edward J. Peng had written it much, much earlier. It's all there. The reliance on Alexander Taylor rather than more recent anthropological studies, along with all of the other scientific studies he cross-references, none of which come from after the 1930s. The post-Victorian, almost prudish moral sensibility. Even the stuffy prose style, damn it, and the patronising and, on reflection, patently early 20th century way in which he discusses the Moni people, not to mention his references to Dutch New Guinea, which hasn't been used since Papua ceased to be an overseas kingdom of the Netherlands, and therefore dates the writing to before 1962. I was able to confirm this after a little dashing around the library, along with the fact that the first Western contact with the Moni was in 1937. So if Peng was one of the first Europeans to live amongst them, it can't have been all that long afterwards. Having radically revised my probable timeline for Edward J. Peng's life and work, I got in touch with Bangor University once again and asked if they had any records of a senior research fellow by that name in the 30s or 40s. Yes, they were delighted to inform me they did indeed. Edward J. Peng had been a senior research fellow from 1938, and although the exact year of his departure and reasons for leaving were slightly mysterious, photos and general records suggested that he had been a prominent member of the department for a few years. There was little, it seemed, by way of actual academic work in the archives, which they clearly felt was unusual. Indeed, after a few weeks of emailing back and forth, I seemed to have aroused the curiosity of their senior archivist, who phoned me in a state of frenzy one evening to say that he had unearthed a file of materials from one of the murkiest corners of the archive. And I can't imagine that anyone has known about it since it was left there, he told me. I made immediate arrangements to visit at the earliest opportunity, barely able to contain my excitement at discovering the secrets that had lain untouched for so long. At this point, things began to get strange. The next day, or possibly it was a couple of days after my chat with the archivist, Bangor University cancelled my visit. Not the senior archivist, who I'd been constantly in touch with, but an officious secretarial type who refused to give reasons except that I had no academic credentials and would not be granted access unless I could provide appropriate permissions. I attempted to contact the senior archivist, but there was no response when I phoned him, and after a few days, the emails I was sending to his address started to be returned as undeliverable. I wrote to the university, phoned them, made inquiries as to how to acquire permissions to see something in their archive, until I was instructed by another officious person, one who I suspected had a more important role than a secretarial one, to desist wasting their time or they would take legal action. I wish Becky had been around, but she had moved on by then and we had rather lost touch. I think she had gone back to live with her parents in the north somewhere. She might have helped put these setbacks into context, or helped me deal with them in a logical way, or calmed my growing paranoia as I tried with increasing desperation to get any access to information about Edward J. Peng. Because everywhere I turned, it was as though I was being deliberately blocked. Perhaps Becky would have told me that it couldn't possibly be deliberate, that I was obviously just making myself unwelcome, but no, it was deliberate. I tried every avenue, went down the route of seeking historical Western connections to the Moni people, tried local news archives in Bangor, historical scientific journals from the 30s and 40s. I went back to all of the places I'd originally offered my article to, updating my submission with everything I had discovered about Edward J. Peng. I even, on one embarrassing occasion, attempted to enter Bangor University's archives uninvited, which ended with a bit of unpleasantness and a few hours in a police cell. Whichever way I turned, I hit walls, in a very literal sense when I was in Bangor, once again facing a conspiracy of silence, the visit to Bangor being the exception. Because conspiracy is what it felt like. The more walls I hit, the more deliberate it seemed. I began to believe that I was the victim of an institutional network of people trying to suppress my discoveries. I began to imagine that my house was being watched. I stopped visiting the British Library. There was nothing to be gained there, and I didn't like to risk leaving the house. I lost my job at the pub. That was my fault, because I stopped turning up, but even so it felt as though it fit into the broader pattern of rejection. Was I being ridiculous? Perhaps. But if the conspiracy was all in my head, then explain this. In a last-ditch attempt to get my work out there to at least some part of the wider world, I started a blog and published the article myself. I sat gazing at the screen, refreshing the page and hoping for comments, hoping for anyone to acknowledge what I had written, any kind of discourse at all. And after exactly 23 minutes, I suppose I got what I was after, in a way. The blog disappeared. Not just the article, the entire blog. My account was no longer recognised. There was no evidence that I had created the page at all. Any subsequent attempts to log into my account or to start a new one were rejected. Conspiracy is all I am left with. Edward J. Peng wrote his book probably in the early 1940s, and both he and his work disappeared into obscurity, except for an anomalous publication some 50 years later. But what if it did have an audience the first time round? What if somebody felt that the theory was too valuable a secret to share? 2 or 3 generations have grown up since then. In what privileged, powerful strata of society might the knowledge have been protected, cultivated, implemented? I am dying of shame, and the people watching my house may not want to wait for nature to take its course, so I fear I am unlikely to live for long enough to find out whether I am right. In any case, if I am, they will outlive all of us by many, many decades. For, just as the truth about Peng's book only dawned on me when I had been staring at the obvious for years, I find that the chilling reality has been sitting in plain sight all along. In my own article. It was naive, of course, to think that tracking down Edward J. Peng would have offered any kind of help, as far as my own shame was concerned, less still that it would have led me towards a solution. I have considered the matter for more than half of my life, and the conclusion, I fear, is obvious. Shame is incurable. Once it has been experienced, the damage is done, and continues to be done. The only possible way to slow down the speed of shame-induced erosion would be to find some way to erase the memories causing it. And honestly, I don't think that erasing swathes of your past, even if it were practical, would be much of a way to live. A solution to the problem of shame would involve a complete societal shift. Children would have to be brought up in an environment free from shame, effectively raised in a moral vacuum, without the slightest concern for the values that we have built into our way of life. When I consider the children that would result from that kind of upbringing, I have to conclude that it couldn't possibly be worth it. The world that they would foster is horrifying, though not impossible, to imagine. You have been listening to Neurotic Literature, written and performed by me, James Lark. If you have enjoyed it, why not leave a review at your podcast platform of choice? Direct other people towards it, spread the word, spread the love. You can also let people know directly, either by talking to them, or probably in this day and age, it's more normal just to leave them a message on social media. You can now show your appreciation using actual real-life money as well at ko-fi.com/neurotic literature. There you can leave a donation which will support further podcasts, or possibly just help me to pay for the very expensive operation which the doctor thinks could save my life.